William Gallagher, 65 years old, and I spent the last 3 years playing the role of a helpless, broke widower just to see if my own flesh and blood actually loved me. Last Tuesday, my son-in-law threw a glass of ice water directly into my face in front of his wealthy business partners, laughing as he called me a pathetic freeloader. My own daughter stood mere feet away, sipping her imported wine, and simply looked the other way. I did not scream. I did not wipe my face. I walked away in absolute silence. The very next morning, I handed him an envelope he arrogantly assumed contained the deed to my home. When he opened it, the absolute terror of what was actually inside hit him so hard, he literally collapsed unconscious on his own patio. Before I dive into the details of this story, please let me know which city or country you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. If you believe that disrespecting your elders should always come with a devastating and undeniable price. The heavy thud of a fist hitting the marble kitchen island echoed through the massive room. Tyler glared at me, his face flushed with a mixture of imported scotch and unadulterated entitlement. He wore a designer suit that cost more than most people make in a month, standing in a kitchen the size of a standard suburban house. "I need that signature right now," William Tyler demanded, pushing a stack of legal documents across the cold marble surface toward me. "I am not asking for a favor. I am giving you an opportunity to actually contribute to this household for once. I am launching a high-frequency crypto investment firm on Monday. The initial capital requirements are massive, and my current assets are tied up in the commercial real estate ventures. The bank needs collateral for the bridge loan. You're going to sign over the deed to the guest house immediately so I can leverage the equity." I stood perfectly still, looking at the aggressive young man who had married my only child. I looked down at the documents. It was a complete transfer of ownership, an unconditional surrender of the only property I supposedly owned in this world. "Tyler," I said, keeping my voice entirely level and devoid of the anger simmering in my chest. "You are asking me to give up the deed to the roof over my head to fund a highly volatile cryptocurrency startup. That is not an investment. That is a gamble. And it is a gamble using my only remaining asset. I will not sign this." Tyler let out a sharp, mocking laugh that bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the kitchen. 3 men sitting at the custom dining table in the adjacent room turned their heads. They were Tyler's prospective business partners, men in their late 20s who drove European sports cars and spoke entirely in corporate buzzwords. They watched the exchange with varying degrees of amusement. "It is not your asset," William Tyler sneered, taking a step closer to me. "It is a building sitting on my land. It is a guest house on my estate. You only live there because I generously allow you to take up space. You have been living here rent-free for 3 years since your wife died. You eat the food my private chef prepares. You use the electricity I pay for. Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain a dependent of your age?" I shifted my gaze from Tyler to the woman standing on the other side of the kitchen island. My daughter Sarah. She was dressed in a silk evening gown, casually leaning against the counter, swirling a glass of dark red wine. I waited for her to intervene. I waited for the little girl I had raised, the girl I had comforted through nightmares and celebrated through every milestone, to tell her husband to step back and show some respect. Sarah took a slow sip of her wine and finally met my eyes. Her expression was entirely devoid of warmth. "Tyler is right, Dad," Sarah said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that cut deeper than any knife. "You really do owe us. We have bent over backwards to accommodate you here. You are a 65-year-old widower. What do you even need financial independence for? You do not travel. You do not buy anything. You just sit in the garden and read old books. Tyler is trying to build a legacy for our family, and you are standing in the way out of pure, stubborn selfishness." I felt a cold weight settle in the absolute center of my chest. It was the crushing realization that the daughter I loved had been entirely consumed by greed. She did not see a father standing before her. She saw a depreciating asset, a stubborn obstacle standing between her husband and a bank loan. "Sarah," I said gently, giving her one final chance to locate her humanity. "If I sign this deed and Tyler's crypto venture fails, the bank will foreclose on the guest house. I will have nowhere to live. I will be out on the street. Are you truly comfortable taking that risk with my life?" Sarah rolled her eyes, letting out an exasperated sigh. "Stop being so dramatic, Dad," she muttered, setting her wineglass down with an annoyed click. "Tyler is a financial genius. The venture is not going to fail. And even if it did, we would put you in a nice assisted living facility. It is probably where you belong anyway at your age. Just sign the papers and stop embarrassing us in front of the guests." I looked back at the legal documents. I reached out and gently pushed them back across the marble island toward Tyler. "My answer is no," I stated clearly. "I will not sign over my home to fund your gambling habit. This conversation is over." Tyler's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He could not handle the rejection, especially not in front of his wealthy friends who were watching from the dining room. His entire fragile ego rested on the illusion of absolute control, and a supposedly broke elderly man was defying him in his own kitchen. "You ungrateful old parasite!" Tyler hissed, his voice trembling with fury. Without a single moment of hesitation, Tyler reached out and grabbed the heavy crystal glass of ice water resting on the counter. With a vicious, sweeping motion, he hurled the contents directly into my face. The freezing water hit me with the force of a slap. Ice cubes bounced off my forehead and clattered noisily onto the marble floor. The freezing liquid soaked my glasses, dripped down my nose, and saturated the collar of my worn cardigan. The sudden shock of the cold was nothing compared to the profound, heavy silence that instantly fell over the room. From the dining room, one of the business partners let out a low, cruel chuckle. Tyler stood over me, his chest heaving, a triumphant smirk replacing his anger. "You are a freeloader, William," Tyler spat, pointing a finger directly at my soaked chest. "You are a pathetic, useless burden. You will sign those papers by tomorrow morning, or I will have my security team throw your belongings onto the street and change the locks on that guest house. Now get out of my sight." The water dripped slowly from my chin onto the floor. I did not raise my hand to wipe my face. I did not raise my voice. I did not show them a single ounce of the righteous fury that was currently detonating inside my mind. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Sarah. I wanted to see her reaction to her husband physically assaulting her elderly father. I wanted to see if there was a shred of horror, a single spark of protective instinct left in her soul. Sarah looked at my dripping face, her expression entirely blank. Then she simply turned her back to me, picked up her wineglass, and walked toward the dining room to join the guests, completely ignoring my existence. That was the exact moment the father she knew died. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I walked across the manicured lawn in the dark, the cold night air biting at my wet clothes. I reached the guest house, stepped inside, and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. I closed all the blinds. I took off my soaked glasses and dried them methodically with a towel. I walked over to the floorboard beneath my bed. I pulled back the rug, pried up the loose wooden plank, and retrieved a small, heavy black lockbox. I entered the combination and opened the lid. Inside rested a heavy encrypted satellite phone, a device I had not powered on in over 5 years. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated the dark room with a harsh blue glow. I waited for the secure signal to connect. I dialed a number I knew entirely by heart. The line rang exactly twice before a deep, calm voice answered. "Good evening, Mr. Gallagher," Bennett said. Bennett, I replied, my voice steady and cold. The testing phase is officially over. They failed. Activate everything. Freeze all shadow accounts, initiate the forensic financial audit on Tyler Lawson, and prepare the foreclosure protocols. We are taking it all down. Understood, Sir Bennett replied without a trace of surprise. The machinery will be fully operational by sunrise. I ended the call and placed the phone back in the box. Tyler thought he had humiliated a broke, helpless old man. He did not realize he had just declared war on the man who secretly owned the very ground he was standing on. The physical assault was over, but the absolute destruction of their lives had just officially begun. The neon sign of the Midnight Diner flickered violently against the rain-slicked asphalt. It was 2:00 in the morning, and the city was completely dead. I sat in a vinyl booth in the back corner, nursing a cup of black coffee that tasted like burnt copper. The diner was a far cry from the marble counters and imported wine of my son-in-law's kitchen, but I preferred it this way. I preferred reality over expensive illusions. The bell above the glass door chimed. Bennett walked in, shaking the cold rain from his dark wool overcoat. He was a man who charged $2,000 an hour for his time, a senior partner at the most ruthless corporate law firm on the East Coast. Yet here he was, in the middle of the night, sitting across from a man wearing a damp, cheap cardigan. Bennett did not care about the cardigan. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly what I was capable of. He slid into the booth and placed a thick leather briefcase on the sticky laminate table. He ordered a black coffee from the tired waitress, waited for her to walk away, and then looked directly at me. "I am sorry about what happened tonight," William Bennett said, his voice low and devoid of pity. "I reviewed the security footage from the guest house cameras you installed last month. The assault was unprovoked and legally actionable. We can press criminal charges for the battery immediately." I shook my head slowly, wrapping my cold hands around the ceramic coffee mug. "A simple assault charge is a temporary inconvenience, Bennett. Tyler would pay a fine, hire a defense attorney, and use the situation to play the victim. He would spin a story about the stress of dealing with a senile father-in-law. I do not want to inconvenience him. I want to dismantle him entirely." Bennett nodded, his expression turning purely professional. He unlatched the briefcase. 10 years ago, when my wife was diagnosed with terminal cancer, we had a long, painful conversation about the future. I had spent 40 years building Gallagher Global Logistics from a single delivery truck into an international supply chain empire. I was a titan in the industry, but at home I was just a man terrified of losing the love of his life. Before she passed, she held my hand and warned me about the wealth. She warned me that money attracts parasites, and that our daughter Sarah was already showing signs of terrible greed. She begged me to protect our legacy. So I disappeared in plain sight. I sold the entire logistics empire to a private equity firm through a highly fortified blind trust. I walked away with over $800 million fully insulated and entirely untraceable. To the outside world, and more importantly to my daughter, my company had simply gone bankrupt after the medical bills drained my accounts. I moved into their guest house playing the role of a defeated, penniless widower. I wore cheap clothes. I drove a 10-year-old sedan. I needed to know if my only child would love me when I had absolutely nothing to offer her but my presence. Tonight, I received my final answer. The test was officially over. Bennett pulled a thick stack of manila folders from the briefcase and aligned them perfectly on the table. "Let us begin with the primary residence," Bennett stated, opening the first folder. "Tyler believes he is a financial mastermind. He boasts to his friends about the incredible mortgage rate he secured for that $8 million mansion. He truly believes he outsmarted the market." I let out a bitter, joyless laugh. Tyler was an arrogant fool. He did not secure a loan from a traditional bank. The boutique lending firm that financed his extravagant lifestyle was a shell corporation created by Bennett. I was the sole shareholder of that corporation. I literally owned the mortgage on the house where Tyler had just thrown water in my face. He demanded the deed to my tiny guest house, completely unaware that I owned the very dirt beneath his custom Italian leather shoes. He has missed 2 consecutive payments on the mortgage. Bennett continued tapping a manicured finger against a financial ledger. He is funneling all his liquid assets into this new cryptocurrency venture. The terms of the mortgage contract he signed are incredibly strict. A third missed payment triggers an immediate default clause. We do not have to wait for a judge. We can initiate a direct foreclosure and seize the property within 72 hours. I looked at the numbers on the paper. For 3 years, I had watched Tyler parade around that mansion, treating the staff like garbage, treating me like a stray dog he had taken in out of forced charity, all while I was secretly paying the property taxes he could not afford, all while I was quietly funding the illusion of his success. Initiate the default. I commanded, my voice colder than the rain outside. He wants to talk about financial independence. Let us give him a masterclass in aggressive debt collection. Bennett made a swift note on his legal pad. He did not flinch. He was a weapon, and I was finally pulling the trigger. However, Bennett said, pausing and looking up at me with a sudden sharp intensity, "The missed mortgage payments are the least of your son-in-law's problems." While we were auditing his accounts to prepare the foreclosure, my forensic accounting team uncovered something much darker. Tyler has not just been making bad investments. He has been actively committing federal crimes, and your daughter is entirely complicit. I felt my posture stiffen. I leaned forward, the diner fading into the background. My daughter was greedy, yes, but criminal activity was a different level of betrayal. "Show me," I demanded. Bennett pulled a second folder from the briefcase. This one was marked with a red confidential stamp. He opened it, revealing dozens of bank statements, forged signatures, and shadow loan applications. The silent war had just escalated from a lesson in humility to an unavoidable collision with the federal justice system. The folder felt heavier than the first one. It was thick with bank statements, notary stamps, and legal contracts. Bennett pushed it across the table with the precise caution of a man handling a live explosive. I opened the cover. The harsh fluorescent light of the diner illuminated a stack of loan applications from 3 different high-risk private lenders. I stared at the first page. It was a promissory note for $400,000 dated 6 months ago. At the bottom of the page, on the line designated for the primary guarantor, was my name, William Gallagher. The signature was a remarkably close imitation of my own handwriting. I traced the curves of the ink with my eyes. Tyler had not just practiced this casually. He had perfected it. He had spent hours studying my signature, likely lifting it from the simple birthday cards I had given them, or the meager grocery lists I left on the kitchen counter. He had weaponized the mundane, intimate details of my life to commit high-level financial fraud. I turned the page. There was another loan for $600,000, then another for $300,000. In total, over the past 6 months, Tyler had secretly borrowed nearly $1.5 million against the fabricated equity of my guest house and my stolen identity. He had submitted fake tax returns, fabricated bank statements, and manipulated digital notary seals. He had built a massive, precarious house of cards using my name as the absolute foundation. Bennett leaned forward, his voice a steady hum over the sound of the rain hitting the diner window. "Your son-in-law has been lying to everyone," William Bennett explained. "His commercial real estate ventures are not just underperforming. They are completely bankrupt. He owes millions to aggressive private creditors who do not play by the standard rules of banking." The cryptocurrency firm he was boasting about tonight is not a new business venture. It is a desperate, frantic attempt to gamble his way out of a massive financial crater. Bennett pointed to a highlighted section on the third bank statement. He needed your signature tonight to secure a final bridge loan because his shadow lenders have officially cut him off. He is drowning in debt of his own making, and he decided to use you as his life raft. He bypassed standard banking security by using unregulated private equity lenders who do not look too closely at the paperwork, as long as the collateral appears solid on the surface. And to them, a retired widower living on a luxury estate looked like perfect, silent collateral. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach. It was not the money. The money was entirely irrelevant to me. I had hundreds of millions safely secured in blind trusts. It was the sheer, calculated malice of his actions. Tyler had looked me in the eye every single day for 6 months. He had eaten the meals I occasionally cooked. He had smiled at me over Sunday dinners, all while systematically stealing my identity and plotting my absolute financial ruin. He had the audacity to call me a freeloader tonight while he was actively robbing me blind. But the darkest revelation was yet to come. Bennett watched my face, carefully gauging my emotional state before he spoke his next words. Look at the guarantor sections on page 4 of each contract, William Bennett instructed quietly. Look at the co-signer lines. I turned to the 4th page of the thickest loan document. Right below my expertly forged signature was another name. Sarah Lawson. It was not a forgery. I had watched my daughter write that exact signature on her homework assignments when she was a little girl, on her college applications, and on her marriage certificate. It was rushed, looping, and undeniably hers. The air in my lungs suddenly turned to heavy ash. I could not breathe for a long moment. I could process Tyler being a monster. I had never truly trusted him from the day they met. But Sarah was my own flesh and blood. She had known everything. She had not merely turned a blind eye to her husband's arrogance or his casual cruelty toward me. She was an active, willing participant in a federal crime against her own father. She had sat in that kitchen tonight, sipping her imported wine, telling me I owed them for my room and board, fully aware that she had already helped steal $1.5 million in my name. I thought about the logistics of the crime. Tyler could not have done this alone. Sarah had to have intercepted my mail. She had to have provided him with my old tax documents from the attic. She used her position as my trusted daughter to facilitate the theft of my identity. She co-signed the fraudulent documents, Bennett explained, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over our table. She authorized the transfer of the stolen funds directly into their joint accounts. She is not a naive victim of his manipulation, William. She is a full co-conspirator. If we hand these dossiers over to the federal authorities, your daughter will be indicted alongside him. She will face multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud. She will be looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. I closed the folder. The cardboard cover slapped against the table with a final definitive sound. The diner was quiet. The tired waitress was wiping down the counter at the far end of the room, completely oblivious to the fact that a family had just been completely destroyed in booth number 4. I thought about Sarah turning her back on me when Tyler threw the freezing water in my face. I thought about the absolute emptiness in her eyes when I asked her if she was comfortable putting me out on the street. I had spent my entire life trying to protect her from the harsh realities of the world. When her mother died, I promised I would always keep her safe. I had built a massive empire just to ensure she would never know the pain of poverty or desperation. I had willingly lived in a tiny guest house wearing cheap clothes just to stay close to her. And in return, she had chosen to throw me to the wolves for a few more months of living in a counterfeit mansion paid for with stolen money. I looked across the table at Bennett. The profound grief that had been suffocating me for the last 10 minutes slowly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, impenetrable armor. I realized that the daughter I loved had died a long time ago, replaced by a greedy stranger who viewed me only as a resource to be exploited and discarded. She made her choice, Bennett, I said, my voice completely devoid of hesitation or sorrow. I am no longer her father, and she is no longer my daughter. They are simply two criminals who have made a fatal miscalculation. Prepare the evidence for the federal prosecutor. We will deliver the dossiers directly to the authorities first thing in the morning. We will not give them any warnings. We will not give them any chances to negotiate or hire defense attorneys to hide the money. They wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life and my dignity. Now they are going to learn what happens when they sit at a table with a man who secretly owns the entire casino. Bennett nodded, his face a mask of absolute professional resolve. He placed the folders back into his heavy leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. The sound was like the closing of a prison cell door. The silent machinery of their destruction was now fully operational. Tyler thought he had won the war by humiliating an old man in front of his friends. He had no idea that his entire existence was about to be erased by the very man he had underestimated. Bennett reached into the bottom of his leather briefcase. I thought the financial devastation was the final blow, but the grim set of his jaw told me otherwise. He pulled out a single thin manila folder distinct from the heavy financial dossiers we had just reviewed. He placed it squarely in front of me, resting his hand on top of it for a brief moment, as if to brace me for the impact. This was not found by the forensic accountants, Bennett said, his tone dropping to a quiet, dangerous register. This was flagged by the cybersecurity team monitoring the corporate servers. Tyler is not a very smart criminal, William. He used his company email, the company that is technically owned by your trust, to correspond with a bottom-feeding probate attorney. We have full legal access to these communications. I need you to read this carefully. I opened the thin folder. Inside was a printed email chain and a drafted legal document. I looked at the title of the document. Petition for Emergency Conservatorship. The words sat on the page like a physical threat. I read the legal jargon, my eyes scanning the paragraphs, and a new profound level of horror began to wash over me. This was not a loan application. This was a petition to declare me legally incompetent. It was a formal request to the state to strip me of my basic human rights, my bodily autonomy, and my financial independence. I read the specific claims outlined in the petition. Tyler and Sarah were alleging that I was suffering from rapidly advancing dementia. They claimed I was prone to violent, unpredictable outbursts. I felt my blood run cold as I read a specific paragraph detailing the events of tonight. The petition stated that I had attacked Tyler in the kitchen during a paranoid delusion, and that Tyler had been forced to subdue me. They were twisting his assault on me into fake evidence of my mental decline. Bennett watched my eyes moving across the page. They are planning to file this on Monday morning, he explained. They are requesting an emergency ex parte hearing. That means they want the judge to grant them temporary control over you before you even have a chance to defend yourself or hire your own legal counsel. Once that order is signed, William, you cease to be a free man. They would have the legal authority to force you into a locked psychiatric facility. They would have total control over every bank account, every medical decision, and every breath you take. You would not be allowed to drive a car or vote or even choose what you eat for dinner. I turned to the second page of the document. It was an affidavit fully drafted and waiting for a final notarized signature. It was written from the perspective of my daughter. I read the words Sarah had supposedly dictated to the probate attorney. She claimed she was terrified of me. She claimed I no longer recognized her on certain days, that I was a danger to myself, and that placing me in a secure medical facility was the only compassionate option left for the family. She was going to stand before a judge and swear under oath that her father had lost his mind, all so her husband could secure the collateral for a fraudulent cryptocurrency scam. I realized she must have been watching me for weeks, twisting innocent moments into fabricated medical symptoms. If I misplaced my reading glasses, she noted it as cognitive decline. If I preferred to sit quietly in the garden rather than listen to Tyler boast, she framed it as depressive withdrawal. She had weaponized my peaceful existence to build a cage for me. The financial theft was a crime of greed. But this petition was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. They did not just want my money. They wanted to erase me. They wanted to lock me in a white room until I died so they could maintain their lavish lifestyle without the inconvenience of my physical presence. I looked up from the document. The diner around me felt entirely distant, as if I were looking at it from underwater. The betrayal was so absolute, so fundamentally unnatural, that it felt like a physical weight crushing my ribs. I had spent my entire adult life building a fortress to protect my family, and my own daughter was currently manufacturing the very chains she intended to lock me in. "This changes the parameters of our response," Bennett said smoothly, interrupting the heavy silence. "We are no longer just protecting your financial assets. We are protecting your freedom. If they manage to file this petition on Monday, it will trigger a mandatory investigation by Adult Protective Services. It will tie us up in probate court. It will give them leverage. We cannot allow this document to see the light of day." I closed the folder. The paper felt toxic against my skin. The cold, impenetrable armor that had formed around my heart when I saw Sarah's forged signature now solidified into solid steel. Any lingering paternal softness, any tiny fragile hope that my daughter might eventually find her way back to the light was permanently eradicated. She was no longer a misguided child. She was an active, dangerous predator. I realized in that exact moment that I did not just need to leave their property. I did not just need to cut off their funding. I needed to surgically amputate them from my life. I needed to ensure that they would never under any circumstances have the power to threaten my freedom again. And I needed to do it before Monday morning. "You are right, Bennett," I said, my voice eerily calm. "We cannot wait for the foreclosure process to simply run its course in the background. We need to completely paralyze them. We need to strike them so hard and so fast that they do not have the breath to speak a single lie to a judge." I looked at the digital clock glowing red above the diner kitchen. It was 3 a.m. Tyler was hosting his brunch for the new prospective investors on the patio tomorrow morning. He was going to parade around his counterfeit mansion, serving expensive food paid for with stolen money, trying to secure the final piece of his fraudulent puzzle. He expected me to walk out there and hand him the deed to the guest house. He expected me to surrender. "Bennett, I want the foreclosure notice finalized and sealed." I instructed my mind, moving with the absolute clarity of a man fighting for his life. "I want the federal indictment referral regarding the wire fraud prepared and ready for submission. But more importantly, I want a copy of this exact drafted conservatorship petition printed out. Put all 3 documents into a single heavy envelope." Bennett raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his usually stoic features. "You are going to hand-deliver the trap to him?" "Yes," I replied. "He wants a document from me tomorrow morning. I am going to give him exactly what he asked for. I want him to open that envelope in front of every single investor he is trying to impress. I want him to read the foreclosure notice and realize he is homeless. I want him to read the federal fraud referral and realize he is going to prison. And I want him to see his own drafted conservatorship petition, so he knows with absolute certainty that I am completely aware of the monster he is. We will execute the legal freeze on all their banking assets at exactly 8:00 tomorrow morning." Bennett confirmed, making quick notes on his pad. By the time he opens that envelope, his credit cards will be useless. His accounts will be locked. He will not be able to buy a cup of coffee, let alone hire a defense attorney to stop the foreclosure. "And Sarah," I added, feeling a final brief hollow ache in my chest, before burying it forever. "When the bank freeze happens, ensure her personal accounts are included. She co-signed the fraudulent loans. She is legally liable. Strip her of every single penny. Consider it done, William Bennett said, closing his briefcase for the final time tonight. He slid out of the booth and stood up, buttoning his coat. I will have the envelope delivered to the guest house by courier before 9 in the morning. Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a very destructive day. I watched Bennett walk out into the rain, the neon light of the diner reflecting off the wet pavement. I did not feel tired. I ordered another cup of black coffee and sat alone in the quiet diner for a long time. I thought about the little girl who used to hold my hand while we walked through the park. I grieved for her. I mourned the daughter I had lost, but the woman who currently lived in that mansion was an enemy who wanted to steal my freedom. I finished my coffee, stood up, and walked out into the cold night air. I drove my old sedan back to the sprawling estate. I parked silently and walked into the guest house. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark living room watching the sun slowly rise over the manicured lawns. I waited for the courier. I waited for the morning. I waited to completely dismantle their world. The sun rose over the manicured lawns of the estate, casting long golden shadows across the imported stone patio. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, the kind of morning that felt entirely disconnected from the ugly reality of the people occupying the house. From the window of the guest house, I watched the catering staff arrive in a pristine white van. They carried silver trays of lobster rolls, imported caviar, and tall crystal champagne flutes. Tyler was hosting his brunch, pulling out all the stops to impress the 3 private equity investors he desperately needed to fund his fraudulent cryptocurrency venture. I could hear Tyler's voice carrying clearly across the garden. He was laughing loudly, a forced, arrogant sound designed to project absolute confidence. He stood at the head of the long teak dining table wearing a crisp linen suit, gesturing broadly at the sprawling estate. He told the investors about the supposed history of the property, claiming he had purchased it for a steal and renovated it with his own unique vision. He was selling them an illusion of total financial stability and massive wealth. He pointed to the luxury sports cars parked in the circular driveway. He poured $1,000 champagne into their glasses with a heavy hand. He spoke at length about his rigorous ethical standards and his brilliant risk management strategies. He was the perfect picture of a young, unstoppable titan of industry. Sarah was right beside him, wearing a designer sundress, smiling and nodding at every single lie her husband told. She played the role of the adoring, successful wife flawlessly. She commanded the catering staff with sharp, impatient hand gestures, treating the waiters with the same casual disdain she had shown me the night before. She had absolutely no idea that exactly 2 hours ago at 8 o'clock sharp, Bennett had executed a total legal freeze on every single bank account tied to her name. She was currently standing on a foreclosed patio eating expensive food she could no longer pay for, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine suspended directly above her head. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the guest house, I did not put on my usual worn-out khaki pants or the faded wool cardigan. Those clothes belonged to a character I was no longer playing. The test was over, and the time for humility had passed. I walked to the back of my closet and unzipped a heavy canvas garment bag. Inside was a bespoke charcoal gray suit custom-tailored for me in London during my final year as the Chief Executive Officer of Gallagher Global Logistics. I put on a crisp white dress shirt. I fastened a dark silk tie. I slipped on a pair of polished leather Oxfords that had once walked the floors of international boardrooms. When I looked in the full-length mirror, the frail, defeated widower was completely gone. The man staring back was the man who had built a global empire from a single delivery truck. My posture straightened, discarding years of calculated submissiveness. The strength in my jaw returned. I picked up the heavy sealed white envelope resting on the kitchen counter. It contained the formal foreclosure notice, the federal fraud indictment referral, and the drafted conservatorship petition. It was not just paper. It was the physical manifestation of their absolute destruction. I stepped out of the guest house and walked across the manicured lawn toward the patio. I did not shuffle my feet. I walked with the measured, deliberate stride of a man who owned the very ground beneath him. The morning breeze caught the fine fabric of my suit. The gravel crunched under my leather shoes, a steady rhythmic sound that signaled an approaching storm. As I approached the patio, the animated conversation among the investors began to falter. One of the men, an older gentleman with silver hair and a sharp gaze, noticed me first. His eyes drifted away from Tyler and locked onto me. He recognized the undeniable aura of authority. He recognized the cut of a $10,000 suit. He saw a man who absolutely did not belong in the subservient narrative Tyler had undoubtedly spun about his pathetic, burdensome father-in-law. Tyler noticed the sudden shift in his audience and turned around. His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw me approaching. He blinked, clearly thrown off balance by my appearance. He was expecting the broken old man he had assaulted with freezing water the night before. He was expecting a trembling hand delivering a surrendered deed. Instead, he was looking at an imposing figure of raw corporate power. But Tyler's ego was far too massive to allow him to process the danger standing right in front of him. He quickly recovered his smirk, turning back to his investors with a smooth, dismissive wave of his hand. "Ah, gentlemen," Tyler announced, his voice booming across the patio to ensure everyone heard. "This is my father-in-law, William. I apologize for the interruption. I told you he is going through a bit of a difficult transition phase. It seems he decided to play dress-up for the occasion." Sarah turned and stared at me, her eyes narrowing in profound confusion. She looked at the expensive fabric of my suit, then down at the thick white envelope in my right hand. Tyler stepped away from the table and walked quickly toward me, intentionally blocking me from getting too close to his guests. He lowered his voice to a harsh, demanding whisper, though his face maintained a fake, polite smile for the audience watching us. "You actually put on a suit," Tyler muttered, his eyes dropping greedily to the envelope. "I assume that is the signed deed to the guest house. Good. You finally realized you have absolutely no other choice. Hand it over right now, go back to your little room, and let me finish securing this capital." I did not hand it to him immediately. I stood perfectly still, looking directly into his eyes. I wanted to memorize the smug, confident expression on his face. I wanted to remember exactly how he looked in his final moments of perceived triumph before I took everything away. The investors were watching us quietly, sensing the sudden, thick tension radiating from our interaction. The morning birds seemed to stop singing. The clinking of the silver forks against the porcelain plates ceased entirely. The stage was perfectly set. I stepped fully onto the imported stone patio, the heavy soles of my custom Oxfords echoing with a slow and deliberate rhythm against the stone. The three private equity investors remained entirely silent, their eyes tracking my every movement. They were men who made a living reading the room, calculating risk, and recognizing raw power. Right now, all their finely tuned financial instincts were screaming that the narrative they had just been sold was fundamentally flawed. The man, they were told, was a broke and senile burden, was walking toward them wearing a suit that cost more than their luxury watches, carrying himself with the absolute posture of a king surveying his conquered territory. I did not look at the investors. I kept my gaze locked entirely on Tyler. He stood at the head of the long teak dining table, a crystal champagne flute frozen halfway to his mouth. The smug and dismissive smile he had worn just seconds ago was beginning to crack at the very edges, replaced by a sudden twitch of nervous energy he could not quite hide. The morning breeze carried the scent of expensive catered food and blooming jasmine, a stark contrast to the thick hostility radiating from the center of the patio. Tyler set the glass down on the table. The sharp clink of the expensive crystal against the polished wood sounded like a gunshot in the incredibly tense morning air. He forced a broad and condescending smile, desperately attempting to regain control of the stage he thought he owned. He puffed out his chest and let out a loud theatrical chuckle, turning his head to wink directly at the wealthiest investor sitting to his right. He was playing a dangerous game of pretend, trying to convince these powerful men that my sudden and imposing presence was simply a quirky family dynamic. He took 2 steps toward me, extending his hand as if he were greeting a subordinate who had finally learned his proper place in the hierarchy. He looked at the thick white envelope resting in my right hand, his eyes lighting up with unadulterated greed. "Finally, the old man understands how business works," Tyler said, his voice dripping with a sickly, sweet patronization that echoed across the quiet garden. He reached out his hand, his fingers twitching with anticipation. "Did you bring the signed deed, William? It is about time you stepped up and contributed to this family. I am glad you finally saw reason. Just hand it over and we can get back to securing the future of this company." Sarah stepped out from behind her husband, crossing her arms over her designer sundress. She looked me up and down, her face twisting into an ugly and confused sneer. She could not comprehend the transformation standing before her. "Where did you even get that suit, Dad?" she demanded, her tone laced with pure venom and a hint of genuine insecurity. "Are you trying to embarrass us by dressing up like a banker? Give Tyler the papers and go back to the guest house immediately. We are hosting a highly confidential corporate meeting here. You are completely out of your element and you are ruining the morning." I did not look at my daughter. She was already a ghost to me, a total stranger standing in a house she no longer had the legal right to occupy. I focused entirely on the arrogant young man reaching for his own absolute destruction. I did not hand him the envelope immediately. I held it suspended in the space between us, forcing him to wait, forcing him to feel the sudden and massive shift in gravity. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The investors shifted uncomfortably in their padded teak chairs. They could smell the blood in the water. They knew a transaction of power was happening right in front of them, and they knew Tyler was not the one in control. I looked Tyler directly in the eye, stripping away the false mask of the feeble widower he had abused the night before. I let him see the absolute and icy ruthlessness of the man who had crushed international competitors for 4 decades. I let him look into the eyes of a true corporate titan who was about to dismantle his entire existence. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered for just a fraction of a second as a tiny seed of primal fear finally took root in his mind. "I brought exactly what you asked for, Tyler," I said. My voice was incredibly low, carrying a lethal calmness that made the warm morning air feel instantly colder. "I brought the documents that will permanently secure your future." I held out the heavy sealed white envelope. Tyler snatched it from my hand with a victorious and arrogant smirk, quickly burying his momentary fear under a thick layer of delusion. He was eager to parade his dominance in front of his silent audience. He weighed the thick package in his hands, completely unaware that he was holding the legal equivalent of a live explosive. He thought he was holding the key to his financial salvation. He did not know he was holding the exact blueprint of his impending prison sentence. He ran his thumb under the sealed flap of the envelope, ready to reveal his prize to the world. Tyler ripped the top of the heavy white envelope with eager and clumsy fingers. He was so desperate to secure his final victory that he tore a small piece of the actual documents hidden inside. He let the torn scrap of the envelope fall carelessly onto the pristine stone patio. It was a piece of trash discarded on an estate he falsely believed he commanded. He pulled out the thick stack of papers with a wide and arrogant smile. There were no immediate sighs of relief. There was no triumphant laughter. He fully expected to see a standard property deed signed at the bottom in blue ink. Instead, he saw a dense stack of heavily formalized legal documents bearing the severe and intimidating letterhead of the most aggressive corporate law firm on the Eastern Seaboard. The top document was printed on thick, textured paper. Tyler adjusted his posture, holding the paper up to the morning sunlight, as if the glare was preventing him from understanding the complex legal words. I watched his eyes scan the bold, capitalized letters at the very top of the page. Notice of immediate foreclosure and seizure of property. I saw the exact second his brain tried to reject the undeniable information in front of him. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head slightly. He looked at the property address listed in the center of the page. It was his exact address. It was the very ground he was standing on. Then his eyes darted to the name of the holding company that owned the mortgage. It was a boutique lending firm he recognized from his desperate attempts to secure more funding over the past 3 years. And right below that, in clear, undeniable print, was the name of the sole proprietor of that holding company. William Gallagher. Tyler looked up from the page, his arrogant smirk completely wiped away. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, or to scream a denial, but the words completely died in his throat. He looked back down at the heavy paper. The document detailed the exact dates of his missed payments, the massive total amount of his delinquent debt, and the 72-hour eviction notice. He realized in that agonizing moment that he was not a wealthy estate owner. He was merely a trespasser living on my land. But the foreclosure was only the first layer of his absolute destruction. His hands began to tremble violently, causing the thick stack of legal papers to rustle loudly in the quiet morning air. He flipped the foreclosure notice over, desperate to find some sort of mistake or a cruel practical joke. He found the second document waiting for him. It was the formal federal indictment referral. I watched his skin turn a sickly shade of pale gray as he read the severe legal charges. Wire fraud, identity theft, federal bank fraud. The document outlined every single shadow loan he had taken out over the last 6 months. It listed the exact dates, the exact dollar amounts, and the exact private equity lenders he had actively defrauded. The legal summary explicitly detailed how he had forged my signature on multiple high-value promissory notes. It also highlighted his wife as an active and willing co-conspirator in the financial crimes. Tyler realized that I had not just casually audited his current bank balances. I had forensically dismantled his entire criminal history. I had gathered enough undeniable evidence to send him and his wife to a federal penitentiary for a decade. The realization hit him with the physical force of a speeding freight train. He took a sudden, ragged breath. A large bead of cold sweat formed at his temple and rolled slowly down his sharp jawline. He was no longer a visionary entrepreneur. He was a cornered felon reading his own impending prison sentence. The 3 private equity investors sitting at the beautiful teak dining table were not fools. They had spent their entire careers reading the subtle signs of corporate panic and financial ruin. They watched Tyler completely unravel in the span of 30 agonizing seconds. The confident young visionary, who had just been pouring expensive champagne and boasting about his brilliant risk management strategies, was suddenly sweating and shaking like a trapped animal. The oldest investor slowly pushed his padded chair back from the table, distancing himself physically and professionally from Tyler. He set his expensive linen napkin down on the table. The investors exchanged silent, knowing glances. They realized the man pitching them a high-frequency cryptocurrency venture was hiding a massive, catastrophic secret. Sarah finally noticed the severe physical shift in her husband. She stepped closer to him, her designer heels clicking sharply against the imported stone. "Tyler, what is it?" she asked, her voice tight with a sudden and uncontrollable anxiety. "Tyler, what did he give you?" Tyler could not answer her. His throat was completely constricted by pure primal terror. His chest heaved as he tried to pull oxygen into his lungs, but his panic was suffocating him. He blindly flipped to the final document in the stack, He did not think it could possibly get any worse. He thought the loss of his home and his freedom was the absolute bottom of the abyss, but I had saved the most devastating piece of paper for last. It was the printed copy of the drafted petition for emergency conservatorship. It was the exact email he had sent to the bottom-feeding probate attorney at 2 in the morning. It was the cruel and malicious document where he and Sarah had conspired to have me declared mentally incompetent and locked in a secure psychiatric ward. I watched his panicked eyes lock onto the familiar words he had typed just hours ago. This was the ultimate killing blow. He realized that I knew absolutely everything. I knew about the financial theft, but more importantly, I knew about the profound evil he harbored in his soul. He realized I had total access to his secure corporate servers. He realized there was absolutely nowhere he could hide from my reach. I had cornered him financially, legally, and psychologically. The heavy walls of his counterfeit life collapsed inward all at once, crushing him completely. He looked at me one final time. He did not see a frail widower. He saw the architect of his total ruin. He saw a titan who had just executed a flawless checkmate. The physical reaction was immediate and incredibly violent. Tyler let out a high-pitched gasping sound, as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the beautiful garden. His hands lost all their strength. The heavy stack of legal documents slipped from his trembling fingers and scattered across the imported stone patio. The white pages blew gently in the morning breeze, landing near the expensive leather shoes of his prospective investors. Tyler reached up and clawed frantically at his own throat, his eyes rolling back in his head. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished wax corpse. His knees buckled beneath him. He did not stumble gracefully. He simply dropped like a stone. He collapsed cold onto the hard patio, his body hitting the ground with a sickening, heavy thud. He fainted dead away right at the feet of the powerful men he was desperately trying to swindle. Sarah let out a piercing, horrified scream that echoed across the manicured lawns. She dropped to her knees beside him, grabbing his shoulders and shaking his limp body frantically. The three investors stood up immediately. They did not rush forward to offer medical assistance. They took several coordinated steps backward, their faces hardening into masks of pure professional disgust. They looked down at the legal documents scattered across the ground. The oldest investor recognized the bold red stamp of an FBI indictment referral on one of the pages resting near his shoe. He read the words "wire fraud" clearly visible in the morning light. He realized with chilling clarity that he had almost wired millions of dollars to a desperate criminal. The investors began walking away from the table, leaving their champagne glasses full. They were abandoning the toxic environment immediately. I stood perfectly still, watching the absolute chaos unfold at my feet. I did not bend down to offer help. I did not call for a doctor or a glass of water. I simply adjusted the crisp cuffs of my bespoke charcoal suit. Tyler thought the battle was over because his brain had forced him to lose consciousness to escape the terror. He did not understand that his physical collapse was merely the opening act of his nightmare. The investors now knew he was an absolute fraud. The money he desperately needed was gone forever. The silent war had just transitioned into a very loud and very public execution. The morning sun continued to warm the imported stone of the patio, but the atmosphere had turned completely frigid. I stood in my tailored charcoal suit and watched as Tyler slowly began to stir. He let out a low, agonizing groan that sounded like a wounded animal. His perfectly styled hair was flattened against the hard ground, and his expensive linen suit was wrinkled and stained from where he had collapsed near a dropped tray of catered caviar. He blinked his eyes open, staring blankly at the clear blue sky for a few seconds, before the crushing weight of reality came rushing back into his brain. He gasped, pulling himself up onto his elbows. His eyes immediately darted to the scattered legal documents blowing gently across the patio. the foreclosure notice, the federal indictment referral, the drafted conservatorship petition. It had not been a nightmare. It was all violently real. Tyler scrambled to his knees, frantically searching the surrounding area. He looked toward the long teak dining table, expecting to see the three wealthy private equity investors he desperately needed to fund his illusion. The chairs were completely empty. The expensive crystal champagne flutes were abandoned half full on the table. The catering staff had stopped serving and were quietly packing their silver trays into the white van, eager to escape the disastrous and incredibly tense scene. The investors had vanished, taking Tyler's last hope of financial salvation with them. They had seen the federal fraud documents and fled the estate without saying a single word. Tyler realized he was entirely alone. The bridge loan was gone. His reputation was permanently destroyed. He crawled across the stone patio, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the scattered legal documents. He tried to stack the foreclosure notice and the fraud referral together, as if organizing the papers could somehow undo the catastrophic damage. He looked up at me from his knees, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He looked like a terrified child. He opened his mouth to beg or to offer some pathetic excuse, but he could not find his voice. Sarah watched her husband kneeling on the ground in a state of absolute ruin. The shock that had paralyzed her moments ago quickly mutated into a blinding, desperate rage. She could not process the fact that their lavish lifestyle was officially over, so she directed all of her venom entirely at me. She marched across the patio, her designer heels striking the stone like little hammers. She stopped inches from my face, her eyes wide and bloodshot with fury. "Look at what you did to him," she screamed, her voice cracking with loud hysteria. "You malicious, bitter old man. You ruined his meeting. You caused him to collapse. I am calling the police right now. I am going to tell them you physically attacked him. I will tell them you came out here in a psychotic rage and struck my husband. They will arrest you, William. They will drag you out of here in handcuffs and lock you in a cell where you belong." She reached into her expensive designer purse and pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling violently as she prepared to dial the authorities. She was fully prepared to manufacture a felony assault charge against her own father, just to maintain her delusion of control. She wanted to punish me for exposing the truth. I did not take a single step back. I did not raise my hands in defense or offer a frantic denial. I simply looked down at her with absolute pity. I waited for her to unlock her phone screen before I finally spoke. "Go ahead and call them, Sarah," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "Tell them I assaulted him. Tell them I am a violent threat. But before you make that call, I suggest you turn around and look up at the roofline of the guest house." Sarah paused, her thumb hovering over the screen. She slowly turned her head, following my gaze across the manicured lawn. Tucked discreetly beneath the eaves of the small building were 3 high-definition security cameras. I had installed them months ago when I first began to suspect Tyler was snooping around my property, looking for financial documents. They were small black domes, completely unnoticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. They have full audio and visual recording capabilities, I explained, watching the blood rapidly drain from her face. They are currently transmitting directly to a secure cloud server managed by my legal team. They recorded you and Tyler standing on this patio just now, proving I never laid a single finger on him. And more importantly, they recorded exactly what happened last night. They captured Tyler throwing a glass of freezing water directly into my face while you stood by and did absolutely nothing. They captured my completely peaceful exit. Sarah dropped her hand holding the phone. The threat of calling the police evaporated instantly into the warm morning air. She stared at the small black domes and realized that every single lie she had planned to tell the authorities was completely useless. If the police arrived, they would not arrest me. They would review the high-definition footage, they would see the unprovoked battery from the night before, and they would arrest her husband for elder abuse. She had tried to weaponize the law against me without realizing I had already built an impenetrable fortress of digital evidence. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was entirely trapped. She could not lie her way out of this situation, and she could not bully me into submission. The power dynamic had permanently shifted in a matter of minutes. I was no longer the frail, dependent father she could easily manipulate and discard. I was the architect of their absolute downfall, and I had anticipated every single desperate move they would try to make. I looked at the two of them one last time. Tyler was still kneeling on the ground, clutching the documents that proved his guilt, and Sarah was standing frozen in silent terror. They had built a massive house of cards using my money and my name, and I had just calmly removed the foundation. The panic in their eyes was absolute and undeniable, but I knew this was only the beginning of their long and painful descent into reality. Tyler scrambled backward away from the security cameras, as if the small black domes were suddenly going to project a laser and strike him down. The reality of the digital trap had completely shattered his last remaining offensive strategy. He could not fight me physically, and he could not use the police to manufacture a false narrative. He grabbed Sarah by the arm, his fingers digging into her expensive silk sleeve, and dragged her toward the massive sliding glass doors of the mansion. They retreated into the house like two frightened rats fleeing a sinking ship. I remained standing on the patio, the morning sun warming the shoulders of my tailored suit. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sprawling living room, I watched the next phase of my carefully orchestrated plan unfold with absolute precision. Tyler was pacing frantically across the imported Persian rug, his hands tearing through his perfectly styled hair. He was operating purely on the primal instinct of a cornered criminal. The arrogant veneer of the successful entrepreneur had been completely burned away, leaving only a desperate man facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He knew exactly what an FBI indictment referral meant. He knew that the authorities would eventually knock on his massive custom oak front door, and he knew he could not be sitting in the living room when they arrived. His mind was racing through the limited options of survival. He needed a ruthless defense attorney who charged $10,000 a day, or he needed a private jet to a country without an extradition treaty. Both of those escape routes required one specific resource, and he believed he still had access to it. He needed immediate liquid cash. I watched him reach into the pocket of his wrinkled linen trousers and pull out his smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device onto the hardwood floor. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand as he desperately tried to unlock the screen. The facial recognition software failed to register his features because his face was contorted in pure panic. He had to manually type in his passcode, his trembling thumbs missing the numbers twice before he finally gained access to his digital life. Tyler opened his primary banking application. This was the master account, a high-yield private wealth portfolio, where he kept the remnants of his legitimate business earnings intermingled with the massive sums of money he had stolen using my forged signature. He fully intended to initiate an immediate wire transfer, moving every single penny into an untraceable offshore cryptocurrency wallet he had set up months ago. He waited for the loading screen to clear his eyes wide and unblinking. He expected to see a balance of over $2 million. He expected to see the financial safety net he had built on a foundation of absolute fraud. The screen loaded and displayed his total available balance. 0. I could see the physical jolt travel through his entire body, even from my vantage point out on the patio. He stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, staring at the glowing screen. He tapped the refresh icon frantically, convinced it was merely a temporary network glitch or a display error. The small loading circle spun rapidly for a second and then settled on the exact same horrifying number, $0.00. Tyler let out a breathless sound and quickly navigated to his secondary accounts. He opened the portal for his commercial real estate holding company, the account he used to pay the exorbitant mortgage on the counterfeit mansion. It was completely frozen. He checked his high-limit platinum credit cards. The available credit lines had been completely revoked, displaying a negative balance indicating the accounts were permanently locked. Every single digital vault he tried to open was sealed tight. He did not understand the sheer magnitude of the legal snare Bennett had placed around him. Tyler thought he was dealing with a standard civil dispute. He did not know that at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, Bennett had submitted a massive binder of forensic financial evidence to an emergency federal judge. The judge had seen the forged promissory notes, the shadow loans, and the undeniable proof of wire fraud. Based on that overwhelming evidence, the judge had immediately granted an ex parte order to freeze all assets connected to Tyler Lawson and his affiliated shell companies to prevent the dissipation of stolen funds. The legal guillotine had fallen hours before Tyler even woke up to host his disastrous brunch. Tyler began breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his ruined shirt. He dialed the direct phone number for his private wealth concierge at the bank. He paced back and forth near the large stone fireplace, holding the phone tightly to his ear. I watched his mouth moving rapidly as he demanded an immediate explanation. He was likely screaming at the bank representative, threatening to close his accounts and sue the institution for restricting his money. His tirade lasted exactly 10 seconds before the concierge spoke. I could not hear the words being said on the other end of the line, but I could read the exact moment the bank representative informed Tyler of his true situation. Tyler stopped pacing. His shoulders slumped forward as if an invisible weight had just been dropped directly onto his neck. The representative was calmly explaining that the bank was strictly complying with a federal freeze order related to an active criminal fraud investigation. They informed him that his accounts were indefinitely suspended, that they could no longer conduct business with him, and that any further inquiries must be directed to the federal authorities. Tyler slowly lowered the phone from his ear. The digital screen went dark. He was completely severed from the global financial system. He could not wire money to an offshore account. He could not hire a defense attorney to keep him out of prison. He could not even buy a tank of gas to drive his luxury sports car away from the estate. The legal trap was absolutely flawless. Sarah realized something was catastrophically wrong. She walked over to him, grabbing his arm and shaking him, demanding to know why he looked like he had just seen a ghost. Tyler turned his head and looked at her, his eyes completely hollow. He told her the money was gone. I saw Sarah aggressively shake her head in denial. She refused to accept the reality of her sudden poverty. She pulled her own gold-plated smartphone from her designer purse, her fingers moving with frantic speed as she opened her personal banking applications. Sarah had always maintained separate accounts to fund her lavish shopping habits and her imported wine deliveries. She assumed her money was safe because she falsely believed she was insulated from her husband's chaotic business ventures. She logged into her primary checking account. She stared at the screen, her mouth falling open in a silent scream. Her balance was also absolute zero. Bennett had not missed a single detail. My legal team had thoroughly documented Sarah Coe signing the fraudulent loan applications. By knowingly attaching her name to the forged documents, she had made herself entirely legally liable for the stolen funds. The federal judge had not hesitated to include her personal assets in the emergency freeze order. She was a full co-conspirator, and she was now facing the exact same financial obliteration as her husband. Sarah dropped her phone onto the hardwood floor. The screen cracked loudly, a fitting metaphor for her shattered existence. She grabbed the lapels of Tyler's jacket, screaming in his face, hitting his chest with her fists. She was demanding that he fix the situation, demanding that he magically produce the millions of dollars they needed to survive. But Tyler just stood there, absorbing her blows with a vacant and defeated stare. He had absolutely nothing left to offer her. The illusion he had sold her was entirely bankrupt. I watched them turn on each other in the center of the massive living room. The grand chandelier hung above their heads, casting a brilliant light on their absolute misery. They were trapped in a cage made of their own greed. They could not fight, they could not run, and they could not buy their way out of the consequences. The legal trap had closed its steel jaws around them, snapping their future in half. I turned away from the glass windows, feeling a profound and cold satisfaction settling deep within my chest. I walked slowly back toward the guest house, leaving them to tear each other apart in the ruins of their counterfeit kingdom. I poured myself a glass of cold water and sat in the leather armchair near the front window of the guest house. I knew Sarah would not surrender easily. Her entire reality had just been dismantled, and people like her do not reflect on their mistakes when backed into a corner. They lash out with whatever weapons they can find. I watched the long driveway leading up to the estate, knowing she was currently inside the mansion, searching for a way to destroy me. It took exactly 20 minutes for her desperate retaliation to arrive. The flashing red and blue lights of 2 police cruisers cut through the peaceful morning air, reflecting harshly against the tall oak trees and the imported stone of the mansion. The vehicles parked at sharp angles near the front steps, their sirens silenced, but their lights painting the manicured lawns in frantic colors. 4 officers stepped out of the vehicles, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They had received an emergency call from a wealthy address regarding a violent domestic disturbance, and they were fully prepared for a chaotic and dangerous scene. I placed my water glass on the table and stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. I walked to the front door before they even had a chance to approach the porch. I opened the heavy wooden door and stepped out into the morning light. 2 officers were walking briskly across the lawn toward me. Sarah was trailing right behind them, putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her designer sundress was intentionally wrinkled, and she had smudged her expensive makeup to create the perfect illusion of frantic tears. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "Officers, that is him," she cried out, her voice pitching perfectly into the register of a terrified victim. "He is having a complete psychotic break. He came out to the patio this morning and violently attacked my husband. He shoved Tyler to the ground and threatened to kill us. He has severe dementia and he has become completely unhinged. You need to arrest him and place him on an involuntary psychiatric hold right now before he hurts someone else." The lead officer, a tall man with a stern and evaluating expression, stepped onto the porch and raised a firm hand to instruct Sarah to stay back. He looked directly at me, evaluating the supposed threat. He clearly expected to find a confused, aggressive elderly man in a state of undress or extreme agitation. Instead, he found a perfectly calm, 65-year-old man wearing a bespoke suit, standing tall and exuding absolute authority. "Good morning, officers," I said, keeping my voice entirely level and polite. "Please come inside. There is absolutely no need for any alarm or force." The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes scanning my calm demeanor, before stepping across the threshold into the guest house. Sarah tried to follow him inside, desperate to keep her fabricated narrative alive, but I stepped slightly to the side, blocking her path entirely. "I am sorry, Sarah, but you are no longer welcome in my home," I stated clearly. The second officer turned and firmly asked her to remain on the lawn, which only infuriated her further. She crossed her arms and glared at me through the open doorway, her fake tears instantly replaced by a look of pure hatred. "Sir, we received a serious emergency call stating you committed a physical assault against your son-in-law," the lead officer said, taking out a small black notepad. "Do you understand these are very serious criminal allegations?" I nodded slowly, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the officer. "I understand perfectly, officer," I replied. "My daughter is currently attempting to manufacture a domestic violence charge because she and her husband are facing absolute financial ruin this morning. If you look at the roofline directly above your head outside, you will see 3 high-definition security cameras. They record directly to a secure cloud server. I invite you to review the footage from this morning right now. You will see that I never came within 5 feet of Tyler Lawson. You will simply see him collapsing onto the patio from the sheer shock of reading a legal document I handed to him. Furthermore, if you review the footage from last night, you will witness Tyler Lawson throwing a glass of ice water directly into my face in an entirely unprovoked attack. The officer stopped writing. He looked out the door and up at the roofline, spotting the small black domes, then looked back down at my perfectly pressed suit. His posture relaxed significantly, recognizing that the hysterical woman on the lawn had likely filed a false police report to manipulate them. Sarah realized her narrative was rapidly falling apart. She began to yell from the grass, claiming the cameras were fake, claiming I was a manipulative liar who had planted them there to spy on her family. I ignored her entirely. I walked over to the small mahogany desk in the corner of the living room and opened the top drawer. I bypassed the false assault allegation and moved directly to the fatal strike. I am not interested in pressing battery charges against my son-in-law for the water incident, I told the officers, turning back around to face them. I am, however, highly interested in reporting a massive federal crime that has been committed on this property over the last 6 months. I held up a small silver USB drive. I walked over and placed it gently onto the center of the coffee table. This drive contains irrefutable forensic evidence of massive wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft, I explained. Tyler Lawson has forged my signature on multiple high-value promissory notes, stealing nearly $1.5 million from private equity lenders. My legal counsel, Bennett, has already submitted this exact evidence to a federal judge early this morning, resulting in a total asset freeze on both Tyler and Sarah Lawson. The lead officer stared at the silver drive. Local patrol officers do not typically handle million-dollar federal fraud cases, but the specific mention of a federal judge and an active asset freeze fundamentally changed the nature of their visit. "Sir, if what you are saying is true, this is a matter for federal investigators," the officer said carefully, clearly realizing he had stepped into a massive corporate crime scene. I agreed with a slight nod. "I understand that, officer. However, Tyler Lawson is currently inside that mansion, entirely desperate and completely stripped of his financial resources. He is a massive flight risk. I am formally requesting that you detain him for questioning regarding the identity theft and the false police report his wife just filed to facilitate his escape." The officer used his shoulder radio to contact dispatch. He requested a direct line to the federal courthouse to verify the emergency injunction I had mentioned. The radio crackled with static for 2 agonizing minutes. Sarah stood outside, her fake tears completely drying up as a new wave of authentic panic washed over her. She could hear the radio traffic echoing from the officer's shoulder. She knew the absolute truth was catching up to them at hurrying speed, and she could do absolutely nothing to stop the machinery I had set in motion. The dispatch operator finally responded, confirming the active federal freeze order connected to Tyler Lawson and his affiliated holding companies. The operator also noted that the local precinct had already been notified to assist federal agents who were currently en route to the estate. The lead officer looked at me, a profound respect settling into his expression. He picked up the silver USB drive and placed it securely in his uniform pocket. "Thank you for your complete cooperation." "Mr. Gallagher," he said, his tone entirely professional and devoid of any previous suspicion. "Please remain here in the guest house. We are going to speak with Mr. Lawson right now." The 2 officers walked out of the guest house and marched directly across the lawn toward the massive front doors of the mansion. Sarah tried to run after them, screaming for them to stop, begging them to listen to her fabricated story about my dementia one more time. They completely ignored her, their focus locked entirely on the massive front doors. I stepped out onto the porch and watched the final scene of their counterfeit life unfold. Tyler had apparently seen the police cruisers arriving from an upstairs window and had mistakenly believed Sarah had successfully executed her plan. He confidently walked out the front doors, fully expecting to see me being hauled away in restraints. He even had a smug, arrogant smile returning to his face. Instead, the two officers grabbed his arms the exact moment he stepped onto the porch. They spun him around violently, pressing his chest roughly against the expensive custom oak door. The metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing across the quiet estate was the most beautiful and satisfying sound I had ever heard. Tyler shouted in pure shock, demanding to know what was happening, screaming that he was a wealthy property owner and they were making a terrible mistake. The officers read him his rights in a loud, clear voice, explaining he was being detained for suspected federal fraud and the filing of a false police report. They marched him down the stone steps, his designer shoes stumbling over the concrete, and pushed him roughly into the back of the police cruiser. Sarah fell to her knees on the grass, wailing loudly as she watched her husband being hauled away like a common street criminal. She had tried to use the law as a final weapon to destroy me, and the recoil had just completely shattered her entire world. The police cruisers pulled away from the estate, taking Tyler to a concrete cell, leaving Sarah completely alone on the lawn of a mansion she no longer owned. The heavy oak front door of the mansion remained slightly open, swinging gently in the late morning breeze. Sarah stood perfectly still on the manicured lawn, watching the dust settle on the long asphalt driveway where the police cruisers had just vanished. She was entirely alone. For the first time in 3 years, the sprawling luxury estate felt completely hollow. She slowly walked back up the imported stone steps and entered the grand foyer. The house was meticulously designed to be a massive testament to wealth and corporate power, but right now, it just felt like a beautifully decorated tomb. She walked into the expansive living room, stepping over the shattered remains of her gold-plated smartphone resting on the antique Persian rug. The catering staff had fled hours ago, leaving the patio doors always wide open, and the remains of the expensive brunch spoiling in the warm morning sun. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a sudden chill despite the heat of the day. She tried to convince herself that this was all a terrible temporary misunderstanding. She told herself that Tyler would use his connections to hire a brilliant defense lawyer and sort out the fraud allegations before dinner. She clung desperately to the fragile delusion that she was still the wealthy lady of the house and that her father was simply throwing a malicious temper tantrum that she could eventually manage. She walked into the massive gourmet kitchen, intending to pour herself a glass of imported sparkling water to calm her frayed nerves. She reached for the heavy stainless steel handle of the oversized custom refrigerator. The exact moment her fingers made contact with the cold metal, the persistent low hum of the luxury appliance completely stopped. A second later, the recessed lighting above the marble island flickered once and died. The digital displays on the double ovens went completely black. The gentle rush of the central air conditioning system faded into absolute silence. The massive house was instantly plunged into a heavy, suffocating stillness. Sarah stood in the dark kitchen, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. She pressed the gold-plated light switch on the wall repeatedly, but absolutely nothing happened. She walked over to the deep porcelain sink and pushed the chrome handle upward. A brief hollow hiss of air escaped the faucet, followed by a few pathetic drops of water before the line went completely dry. She walked back into the living room and grabbed the wireless landline handset from its charging base on the console table. She pressed it to her ear, expecting to hear a dial tone so she could immediately call the utility company and scream at a customer service representative. The line was completely dead. Bennett had not merely frozen their bank accounts and triggered a federal investigation. He had systematically dismantled the entire invisible infrastructure of their counterfeit life. For 3 years, my blind trust had secretly paid every single utility bill, property tax, and maintenance fee required to keep that massive estate operational. Tyler and Sarah were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never once questioned why the electricity and water always flowed without them ever writing a check. The moment I gave Bennett the green light, he immediately canceled every single account associated with the property address. The harsh reality of the blackout pierced directly through Sarah's thick layer of denial. She was trapped in a dark, silent house with no running water, no working phone, no money, and a husband sitting in a federal holding cell. But instead of feeling remorse or gaining clarity, she felt a blinding surge of familiar entitlement. She immediately directed her rising panic into a furious anger, and she directed that anger entirely at me. She convinced herself that I had manually shut off the power from the main breaker box located in the guest house just to spite her. She simply refused to believe that the frail old man she had abused possessed the logistical power to completely sever her from the outside world. She stomped out the back door of the mansion, her designer heels crunching loudly against the gravel path leading toward my small residence. She was marching over to demand that I turn the power back on. She was going to scream at me, tell me that she was the innocent victim of Tyler's lies, and demand that I open my wallet to fix her ruined life. She crossed the manicured lawn, her face twisted in an ugly mask of pure rage. She reached the small wooden porch of the guest house and did not even bother to knock. She grabbed the brass doorknob, turned it violently, and shoved the heavy door open with her shoulder. "William," she screamed, her voice echoing harshly through the open doorway. "Turn the power back on right now and get out here." She stepped boldly over the threshold, fully prepared to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse, but the hateful words completely died in her throat. The guest house was entirely silent. The air inside felt strangely stale, devoid of the familiar scent of my brewing dark roast coffee or the old leather-bound books I used to read every afternoon. Sarah blinked her eyes rapidly, adjusting to the dim light filtering through the closed window blinds. She walked further into the small living room and stopped dead in her tracks. The room was completely empty. The worn-out armchair where I used to sit and watch television was gone. The small wooden dining table where I ate my modest meals was gone. The antique rug had been rolled up and removed, leaving only bare hardwood floors. She panicked and ran down the short hallway into the single bedroom. It was stripped entirely bare. The wooden bed frame was dismantled, the mattress was missing, and the closet doors were wide open, revealing empty wooden hangers and completely bare shelves. I had not merely packed a small suitcase and walked away. I had completely erased my physical existence from the property. While she was busy watching her husband being arrested and handcuffed on the front lawn, a specialized private moving crew hired by Bennett had quietly entered the guest house from the hidden rear access road. They had methodically packed up my entire life in less than 30 minutes and vanished without a single trace. I did not leave behind a stray sock, a forgotten book, or a single photograph. I had surgically amputated myself from her world. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath catching painfully in her throat. The sheer logistical precision of my departure finally broke through her massive arrogance. I was not hiding in the garden. I was not waiting nearby for an apology. I was permanently and entirely gone. She walked back into the empty living room, her legs trembling uncontrollably as the gravity of her isolation crushed her. As she turned to leave, she noticed a single piece of crisp white paper, taped securely to the inside of the front door, right at eye level. It was the only item left in the entire building. She walked slowly toward it, reading the bold black letters printed at the very top of the page. Official notice to vacate. It was a formal legal eviction order executed by the corporate holding company that now legally possessed the foreclosed estate. The document outlined in cold, uncompromising legal terminology that the current occupants had exactly 72 hours to remove all personal belongings and vacate the premises entirely. It detailed that the property was now classified as a seized asset due to severe mortgage default and pending federal fraud investigations. The notice explicitly stated that failure to comply would result in forced physical removal by the county sheriff's department and the immediate confiscation and auction of any remaining personal property left inside the mansion. Sarah stared at the paper, her eyes reading the terrifying words over and over again, as if the black ink might magically change if she stared long enough. There was no hidden loophole. There was no generous grace period. There was no wealthy, forgiving father waiting in the wings to pay her massive debts and stroke her hair while telling her everything would be fine. She reached out and touched the heavy paper, her trembling fingers tracing the sharp black lines of the legal seal stamped at the bottom. The absolute finality of the situation crushed her completely. She had traded a billion-dollar inheritance and the unconditional love of a devoted father for a fraudulent husband and a counterfeit mansion she was about to be forcibly thrown out of. She slowly slid down the smooth wooden door, her back pressing against the hard surface, until she was sitting directly on the bare floor of the empty guest house. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest and buried her face in her hands. She finally began to cry. These were not the fake, calculated tears she had used to manipulate the police officers just hours earlier. These were the deep, agonizing sobs of a woman who had just realized she had completely and irreversibly destroyed her own life. The silent war was officially over. I had won without ever raising my voice, and she was left sitting entirely alone in the dark and empty ruins of her own devastating defeat. Federal courthouses are intentionally designed to make a person feel incredibly small. The towering marble pillars, the heavy mahogany doors, and the sharp echo of footsteps against polished stone are all meant to strip away the fragile illusions of personal grandeur. It is a place where counterfeit realities go to die. I walked through the metal detectors on Tuesday morning, wearing my tailored charcoal suit, with Bennett walking quietly right beside me. We were not there to participate in the proceedings. My legal team had already delivered the massive binders of forensic evidence directly to the federal prosecutor. I was there simply to witness the absolute conclusion of the silent war I had waged against my own family. We entered the courtroom and took our seats in the very last row of the wooden gallery benches. The room was freezing cold, smelling faintly of floor wax and old paper. I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on my lap. 3 rows ahead of me, sitting entirely alone, was Sarah. I spent a long moment simply looking at the back of my daughter's head. She was wearing the same designer sundress she had worn on the patio during Tyler's disastrous brunch, but it was now terribly wrinkled and stained. Her usually immaculate hair was pulled into a messy knot, and her shoulders were slumped completely forward. She looked like a woman who had not slept or eaten in days. She had been forcibly evicted from the mansion 24 hours prior. Without access to her frozen bank accounts, she was likely sleeping in her car or begging old friends for a couch to sleep on. The friends she had bought with my money had undoubtedly abandoned her the second the federal freeze order became public knowledge. She was experiencing the terrifying free fall of sudden poverty, and she was completely unequipped to survive it. The heavy wooden door beside the judge's bench swung open, and a bailiff stepped into the room. He instructed everyone to rise. The federal judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and an expression of absolute intolerance for nonsense, took her seat at the elevated bench. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened the massive file folder resting in front of her. The file was so thick it looked like a dictionary. It contained every single financial sin Tyler had committed over the last 6 months. "Bring in the defendant," the judge commanded, her voice cutting through the silent courtroom like a steel blade. The side door leading to the federal holding cells opened with a loud metallic clank. 2 armed federal marshals escorted Tyler Lawson into the courtroom. The transformation was absolutely breathtaking. The arrogant young visionary who had thrown freezing water into my face was completely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified man, wearing a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists were bound tightly in heavy steel handcuffs, attached to a chain wrapped around his waist. He shuffled his feet awkwardly, his expensive Italian leather shoes replaced by cheap slip-on canvas sneakers. He had spent the last 3 nights in a concrete cell surrounded by actual violent criminals, and the experience had completely shattered his fragile ego. His face was pale and unshaven. He looked physically smaller, as if the sheer weight of his impending doom had compressed his spine. He took his seat beside a tired-looking public defender. Because his bank accounts were entirely frozen, Tyler could not hire the aggressive, expensive defense attorney he desperately needed. He was forced to rely on a court-appointed lawyer who was overworked, underpaid, and visibly exhausted. Tyler turned his head frantically, scanning the wooden benches of the gallery. He was looking for Sarah, seeking some sort of comfort or validation. He found her and offered a pathetic, trembling smile. Then his eyes shifted to the back row, and he saw me. I did not glare at him. I did not smile. I simply looked at him with the cold, detached observation of a man inspecting a damaged piece of cargo. Tyler physically flinched when we made eye contact. He quickly turned his head forward, staring blankly at the judge's heavy wooden desk. He knew I was the architect of the cage he was currently locked inside. The judge looked down at the prosecutor and then at the public defender. "We are here for the bail hearing of Mr. Tyler Lawson," she stated flatly. "The charges are extensive. Multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, and the filing of a false police report. Counselor, I will hear your argument for bail." The public defender stood up, straightening his cheap suit jacket. He did not sound confident. "Your Honor, my client is a local business owner with deep ties to this community." The public defender began, his voice lacking any real conviction. "He has no prior criminal record. The charges against him stem from a complex series of commercial real estate transactions that simply went bankrupt. He made some terrible accounting errors during a period of extreme financial stress, but he is not a violent threat to society. He is a married man. We are requesting a reasonable bond so he can return to his family and properly prepare his defense against these complex financial allegations." The judge listened to the plea without changing her expression. She looked down at the massive binder Bennett had provided. She slowly turned a page, the sound of the thick paper echoing loudly in the quiet room. "Accounting errors," the judge repeated, her voice dripping with profound skepticism. "Counselor, I have been on the federal bench for 20 years. I have seen men rob banks with shotguns, and I have seen men rob pensions with fountain pens. Your client did not make an accounting error. He executed a highly calculated, predatory, and malicious scheme of identity theft." The judge turned her attention directly to Tyler. "Stand up, Mr. Lawson," she commanded. Tyler slowly rose to his feet, the heavy steel chains around his waist rattling loudly against the wooden table. He kept his head bowed, staring at his canvas shoes. "I have spent the entire morning reviewing the forensic financial evidence provided to this court," the judge continued, her voice rising in volume and intensity. "The sheer audacity of your crimes is genuinely staggering. You forged the signature of your 65-year-old father-in-law on multiple promissory notes. You used his identity to secure over $1.5 million in unregulated shadow loans to fund a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. You submitted fabricated tax returns and manipulated digital notary seals. That is not an accounting error, Mr. Lawson. That is a deliberate, sustained attack on the federal banking system." Sarah sat perfectly still in the gallery. She was hearing the exact numbers being read into the official court record. She was hearing a federal judge validate every single piece of evidence I had handed to Tyler on the patio. The fragile wall of denial she had built around herself was being systematically dismantled by the highest authority in the room. But the judge was not finished. The financial fraud was only the foundation of her absolute disgust. However, the judge said, leaning forward over the heavy wooden bench, what I find truly reprehensible is the nature of your victim. You did not just defraud private equity firms. You actively exploited an elderly family member who was living on your property. The evidence submitted to this court includes high-definition video footage from the night before your arrest. I watched you throw a glass of ice water into the face of an older gentleman who was simply refusing to hand over the deed to his home. I watched you humiliate him. I watched you threaten to throw him out onto the street. You viewed your own father-in-law as completely disposable. Tyler closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and rolling down his pale cheek. He was being publicly dissected. The illusion of the successful visionary was completely dead, and the reality of the monster he truly was had been exposed to the entire world. The judge picked up a specific document from the file. It was the drafted conservatorship petition I had found on his corporate servers. And perhaps the most sickening piece of evidence in this entire binder is this drafted legal petition, she stated, her voice shaking with righteous anger. When you realized you could no longer bully him into signing over his property, you conspired to have him declared mentally incompetent. You planned to stand before a probate judge and lie under oath to strip him of his basic human rights so you could steal his remaining assets. You attempted to weaponize the legal system to cover up your financial crimes. The judge set the paper down and took off her reading glasses. She looked at Tyler with absolute uncompromising contempt. Your public defender claims you are a successful business owner, the judge said. But the financial disclosures tell a very different story. You are entirely bankrupt. Your commercial properties are in default. Your primary residence is currently being foreclosed upon. And you have absolutely no access to liquid capital. But the most glaring miscalculation you made, Mr. Lawson, was entirely underestimating the man you were trying to destroy. This was the moment the earth shifted permanently beneath Sarah's feet. She leaned forward slightly in her wooden pew, her breath catching in her throat. She had always believed I was a pathetic burden. She was about to learn the exact scale of the titan she had crossed. The court has reviewed the ownership structure of the holding company that initiated the foreclosure on your estate, the judge explained, reading from a confidential financial summary provided by Bennett. The court has also verified the origin of the forensic audit that exposed your crimes. You believed you were stealing from a broke, vulnerable widower. You did not realize that William Gallagher is the sole beneficiary of a blind trust valued at over $800 million. He is the former chief executive officer of Gallagher Global Logistics. He secretly owned the mortgage on your home. He funded your entire lavish lifestyle from the shadows. You tried to steal $1 million from a man who possesses nearly $1 billion. You brought a forged piece of paper to a war against a financial giant. A collective gasp echoed through the small gallery. The public defender slowly turned his head and stared at his own client in absolute disbelief. Tyler swayed on his feet, his knees buckling slightly under the crushing weight of the revelation. He had thrown water in the face of a billionaire. He had called the man who secretly owned his entire world a freeloader. The sheer magnitude of his stupidity was so vast, it defied human comprehension. But the reaction that truly mattered to me belonged to Sarah. I watched her back stiffen completely. Her hands gripped the wooden pew in front of her so tightly, her knuckles turned entirely white. The judge's words hit her with the destructive force of a localized earthquake. $800 million. The number echoed in the cold courtroom. Sarah's mind was desperately trying to process the information. She realized that I had not been living in the guest house because I was poor. I had been living there by choice. I had subjected myself to her condescending comments, her coldness, and her husband's abuse simply to test her loyalty. She realized that if she had simply shown me a shred of human decency, if she had simply treated me like a father instead of a burden, she would have eventually inherited an empire. She would have never had to worry about money for the rest of her natural life. Instead, she had co-signed fraudulent loans to steal a pathetic fraction of what would have been freely given to her. She had traded a massive generational fortune for a fake designer lifestyle that had just resulted in her complete eviction and impending criminal indictment. The emotional weight of her profound stupidity crashed down upon her all at once. Her shoulders began to shake violently, and a low, agonizing sob escaped her throat. The judge banged her wooden gavel sharply against the sound block, silencing the whispers in the courtroom. "Mr. Lawson, you are facing decades in a federal penitentiary," the judge declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "You have demonstrated a highly sophisticated ability to manipulate financial systems and commit fraud. You have no home to return to. You have no legitimate business ties. You are the very definition of a severe flight risk and a continuing danger to the financial community. Therefore, bail is categorically denied. You will be remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals and held in federal lockup until your trial." Tyler let out a desperate, terrified wail. He lunged forward against the wooden table, begging the judge for a second chance, begging for house arrest, screaming that he would not survive in a federal prison. The two armed marshals immediately grabbed him by the shoulders, pulling him backward. The heavy steel chains rattled violently as he struggled against their grip. They dragged him away from the defense table, his canvas sneakers dragging uselessly against the polished floor. He looked over his shoulder as they pulled him toward the side door. He was not looking at the judge. He was looking directly at me. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He finally understood that I had not just taken his money. I had taken his freedom, his dignity, and his entire future. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, cutting off his screams and sealing his fate entirely. The judge closed the massive file folder. "We are adjourned," she stated, stepping down from the bench and disappearing into her private chambers. The courtroom slowly began to empty. Bennett stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, and gestured toward the main doors. We walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. As we passed the third row, Sarah slowly turned her head and looked up at me. Her face was completely streaked with dark mascara and tears. Her eyes were hollow, filled with a mixture of profound regret and absolute terror. She knew the federal agents would be coming for her next. She knew her signature was on those documents. She opened her mouth to speak. She wanted to beg. She wanted to call me Dad. She wanted to ask for forgiveness or a high-priced lawyer or simply a warm place to sleep tonight. But I did not stop walking. I did not break my stride. I looked directly into her eyes for a fraction of a second, allowing her to see the cold, impenetrable steel that had replaced my heart. I offered her absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, and no salvation. I simply walked past her, leaving her sitting entirely alone on the hard wooden bench to face the devastating consequences of her own monstrous greed. Exactly 7 days passed since the heavy gavel fell in that freezing federal courtroom. I spent the entire week finalizing the liquidation of my remaining shell companies and transferring the vast majority of my liquid assets into secure philanthropic trusts. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I finally stepped out of the towering glass lobby of Bennett's law firm located in the absolute center of the financial district. A heavy gray rain was washing the city streets, pulling a bitter, biting chill through the concrete canyons. I stood under the deep architectural awning of the building, adjusting the thick collar of my wool overcoat, while I waited for my private driver to bring the town car around to the curb. The world around me felt incredibly quiet and orderly, but the ghosts of my immediate past were not entirely ready to let me go. I noticed a solitary figure huddled against the cold granite wall near the very edge of the awning. She was completely drenched, shivering violently in the damp afternoon air. She wore a thin beige trench coat over a pair of cheap gray sweatpants, a jarring and pathetic departure from the imported silk gowns and custom tailoring she used to parade around the luxury estate. Her hair was plastered to her pale face in wet, dark strands. It was Sarah. She had been waiting out here in the freezing rain for God knows how long, tracking my daily movements, or perhaps simply staking out the only location she knew I still frequented. When she saw me step through the heavy revolving doors, she pushed herself off the wet granite and stumbled forward. She did not walk with the arrogant, entitled strut of a wealthy heiress anymore. She moved like a desperate, terrified beggar. Before I could even raise a hand to signal the building security guards standing just inside the glass, she closed the distance between us and immediately collapsed onto the wet pavement right at my feet. The cold rainwater pooled around her knees, soaking through her thin clothes, but she did not seem to care at all. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my wool overcoat, her hands completely blue and shaking from the freezing temperature. The tears started instantly mixing with the heavy rain pouring down her face. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, pleading for a salvation she absolutely did not deserve. "Daddy, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking and echoing loudly against the smooth glass facade of the office building. "Please, just look at me. You have to listen to me. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything that happened." I did not pull my coat away from her desperate grip, but I did not reach down to help her up either. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the exact woman who had happily co-signed the fraudulent documents to steal my identity and lock me in a secure psychiatric ward. I did not know what he was doing. Sarah cried violently, shaking her head to emphasize her fabricated innocence. Tyler manipulated me. He controlled every single aspect of our lives. You know how aggressive he gets. You saw him throw that freezing water in your face last week. I was completely terrified of him, Daddy. He put those complicated loan papers in front of me and forced me to sign them. I never read them. I never wanted to hurt you or steal your money. He lied to me just like he lied to you and to those wealthy investors. I am a victim too. He ruined my entire life and he left me with absolutely nothing. I listened to her desperate theatrical monologue, listening very carefully to the specific words she chose to use. She was an absolute master of deflecting accountability. She was desperately trying to rewrite history, painting herself as a helpless hostage rather than a willing and eager accomplice to a federal crime. She conveniently forgot the cruel, condescending comments she made to me in the kitchen. She forgot telling me that I owed them for my room and board. She forgot standing by and smirking while her husband humiliated me in front of his guests. Now that Tyler was locked in a federal holding cell and entirely useless to her financial future, she was perfectly willing to throw him directly under the bus to save her own skin. "I have absolutely nowhere to go," Sarah wailed, her grip tightening frantically on the heavy wool fabric of my coat. "The bank seized my car yesterday morning. They froze every single account I have. All of my friends have completely blocked my phone number. I spent the last 3 nights sleeping on a hard plastic chair in a public bus terminal. I am starving, and I am so unbelievably cold. Please, Daddy. I know you have money." I heard what the federal judge said in the courtroom. "You are a billionaire. You can fix all of this misery with a single phone call. Just get me a small apartment. Just pay my rent for a few months until I can get back on my feet and find a job. I will do whatever you want. I will take care of you. We can be a real family again. Please do not leave me out here to die in the street." Her begging reached a frantic fever pitch, her voice echoing down the busy metropolitan sidewalk. A few pedestrians in expensive business suits hurried past us, casting uncomfortable, judging glances at the pathetic scene unfolding under the awning. Sarah was actively weaponizing her misery, trying to trigger the deep paternal instinct I had harbored and nurtured for decades. She was deliberately using the word daddy, a title she had not used with any genuine affection since she was 10 years old. She believed that beneath my cold exterior, there was still a soft and forgiving father who could not bear to see his little girl suffer the consequences of her own actions. She truly believed that the massive wealth I possessed meant my forgiveness was something she could simply demand through a theatrical display of suffering. She thought a few tears and a fabricated story about being manipulated by her husband would instantly erase the profound evil she had committed against me. She looked up at me, her face twisted in a mask of calculated agony, waiting for me to break. She was waiting for me to reach down, pull her into a warm, protective embrace, and promise her that the terrible nightmare was over. She was waiting for the unconditional financial bailout she had received her entire life. I looked at her trembling hands clutching my expensive coat. I looked at the dirty rain washing the remnants of expensive makeup from her pale face. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. The familiar hollow ache I used to feel whenever she was in pain had been completely and permanently removed from my soul. I saw straight through the pathetic performance. She was not crying because she finally realized she had been a terrible, abusive daughter. She was crying because she had permanently lost her limitless bank account. She was mourning the loss of the massive mansion, the designer clothes, and the imported wine. I was not a father to her in this raw moment. I was merely a human checkbook she was desperately trying to cash one final time. I looked down at the woman kneeling in the freezing rain. She was desperately waiting for the familiar warmth of my forgiveness, waiting for the invisible safety net to catch her one last time. For 3 decades, I had rushed to fix every mistake she ever made. If she broke a toy, I bought a new one. If she crashed a car, I paid the insurance deductible. I had built a massive wall of money around her to protect her from the harshness of the world, and inside that comfortable fortress, she had grown into an absolute monster. I did not feel anger anymore. The burning rage that had fueled my calculated revenge over the past week had entirely burned out, leaving behind nothing but a profound and heavy pity. She was a hollow shell of a human being, completely incapable of surviving the reality she had maliciously created for herself. I reached down and gently pulled the wet fabric of my heavy wool overcoat from her desperate grip. She gasped loudly, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the safety net was permanently gone. I did not raise my voice above the sound of the falling rain. I did not need to yell to completely destroy her remaining illusions. I paid your rent for 30 years. Sarah, I said, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. I bought your clothes, I funded your luxury lifestyle, and I paid for every single privilege you ever enjoyed. And it cost me my daughter. You traded my unconditional love for a bank account, and you traded my freedom for a fraudulent husband. I am not going to rescue you today. It is time you learned what things actually cost in the real world. A long, sleek black town car pulled smoothly up to the curb beside us, its heavy tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The rear door opened automatically. Sarah let out a raw, agonizing scream, scrambling forward on her knees across the rough, wet pavement, desperately trying to grab my polished leather shoes, begging for just one more chance. I stepped gracefully into the warm leather interior of the vehicle, ignoring her completely. I sat back against the plush seat and looked out through the open door. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her hands reaching out into the empty, cold space I had just occupied. I reached forward and pressed the small silver button on the door panel. The heavy door pulled shut with a solid, satisfying thud. The thick, tinted glass window rolled up seamlessly, instantly, cutting off the sound of her frantic apologies and her desperate cries for her father. I did not look back as the driver smoothly pulled the car away from the curb. I left her sitting entirely alone on the freezing sidewalk, finally abandoned to face the absolute ruin of her own making. The air up here is entirely different. I sit on the sprawling terrace of my new penthouse apartment 60 floors above the bustling heart of the city. The noise of the traffic below is nothing more than a gentle, distant hum, completely unable to penetrate the absolute peace I have finally secured for myself. The morning sun warms the polished teak table where I am currently sitting alone. There are no imported marble islands, no screaming relatives, and no elaborate lies. There is only the crisp, clean air and the quiet satisfaction of a life completely reclaimed. Resting in front of me is a thick stack of finalized legal documents. They do not contain forged signatures or malicious petitions. They are the foundational charter for the Gallagher Youth Educational Trust. I uncap my gold fountain pen and carefully sign my name on the final page of the heavy document. With a single stroke of ink, I have permanently transferred the vast majority of my $800 million estate into a secure, irrevocable fund. This money will now provide full university scholarships, housing and living stipends for thousands of underprivileged youth across the country. I am giving my wealth to young men and women who actually understand the value of a dollar. I am giving it to kids who have had to fight for every single scrap of opportunity they have ever received. They will not take this money for granted, and they will never throw it away on arrogant illusions. I am finally investing in a future that I can actually be proud of. I set the pen down and lean back in my comfortable chair. I reach out and pick up a heavy crystal glass resting near the documents. It is filled to the brim with ice water. I hold it up to the sunlight, watching the condensation bead on the clear glass. Just a few weeks ago, a glass of ice water was used as a weapon to humiliate me. It was meant to make me feel small, pathetic, and entirely powerless. Now I take a slow, deliberate sip. It tastes incredibly crisp and perfectly clean. It tastes like absolute victory. The silent adjustment is officially complete. I lost a daughter to the toxic allure of unearned wealth, but I have gained thousands of children who will use my legacy to build genuine and meaningful lives. Tyler and Sarah are currently facing the severe, unforgiving reality of the federal justice system. They will spend years paying the heavy price for their profound greed, while I spend my remaining days watching my real legacy bloom. Family is not determined by blood. It is determined by respect, loyalty, and basic human decency. Thank you for listening to my story today. Please remember to cherish the people who truly love you and never let anyone mistake your quiet patience for weakness. Stay safe, and I will see you all in the next video.